Hey guys. Tonight, we're going to settle in for a long, slow drift across the ocean. So go ahead and dim the lights, maybe grab a glass of water, get under the covers, and just let your mind wander a bit. We're going back to the early 19th century, a time when maps were mostly suggestions and hygiene was, well, let's just say it was optional. We are going to talk about a very specific voyage. It's the story of the French frigate Méduse, or as we know it in English, the Medusa. Now, usually when you hear about famous shipwrecks, you think of icebergs or torpedoes or maybe a rogue wave, but the story of the Medusa isn't really about nature trying to kill anyone. Nature was actually being pretty chill for most of this. No, this is a story about bureaucracy, ego, and the very specific kind of disaster that happens when you put a guy in charge just because his last name sounds fancy. It's 1816. We need to set the scene a little bit here, because the vibe in France was complicated. Napoleon Bonaparte had just been defeated at Waterloo a year prior. He was packed up and shipped off to St. Helena to stare at the wall for the rest of his life. The French Revolution was over, the Empire was over, and the old monarchy, the Bourbons, were back in town. King Louis XVIII was sitting on the throne, and he was very keen to pretend that the last 25 years of democracy and meritocracy never happened. The king wanted to turn back the clock. He wanted the good old days where if you were a noble, you got the good jobs, and if you weren't, well, good luck to you. This meant purging the military and the navy of anyone who had been too good at their job under Napoleon. Competence was suddenly suspicious. If you knew what you were doing, you were probably a Bonapartist. So the new government fired the capable officers and replaced them with old aristocrats who had spent the last 2 decades hiding in England or gardening at their country estates. Enter our main character, or rather, our main problem, Hugues du Roy de Chaumareix. Now, de Chaumareix was a viscount. He was 53 years old, he had a very nice uniform, and he had the king's favor. He was exactly the kind of guy the new regime loved. He was loyal, he was noble, and he hated Napoleon. There was just one tiny, insignificant detail that probably should have been mentioned during his job interview. He hadn't sailed a ship in 25 years. And even back when he did sail, before the revolution, he wasn't exactly a master and commander. He was a junior officer who mostly just stood around looking important. But 25 years is a long time to be away from the sea. Technology changes, maps change, your memory fades. But du Chaumareix didn't let that bother him. He had the confidence of a mediocre man who has never been told no. So, in 1816, the British decided to hand the colony of Senegal in West Africa back to the French. It was part of the peace treaties. The French government needed to send a fleet down there to officially take over the port of Saint Louis. They needed to transport the new governor of Senegal, his family, a bunch of soldiers, and plenty of supplies. They put together a convoy of 4 ships. There was the Loire, a store ship, the Argus, a brig, the Echo, a corvette, and the flagship, the beautiful 40-gun frigate, the Medusa. And because du Chaumareix was a viscount and a good guy, he was given command of the Medusa and the entire convoy. The mission was simple: sail south, turn left around Africa, don't hit anything, and drop off the new governor. A standard run, a milk run really. The Medusa was a fast ship. She was sleek, modern for her time, and capable of outpacing almost anything on the water. She was carrying about 400 people. You had the crew, obviously. Then you had the soldiers, the African battalion, who were mostly rough types, some former convicts, some mercenaries. Then you had the bourgeois passengers, Governor Julien Désiré Schmaltz, his wife Reine, and their teenage daughter. They brought along their own furniture, their trunks full of silk dresses, and their sense of entitlement. Governor Schmaltz is an interesting character. He was an engineer by trade, a bureaucrat by nature. He was going to Senegal to run the place, and he fully expected the trip to be comfortable, efficient, and dignified. He and Captain de Chaumareix got along well at first. They were both men of the new order. They both looked down on the common sailors who had served under Napoleon. The ship was loaded at Rochefort in June of 1816, and right from the start, things were chaotic. The Medusa was overcrowded. People were tripping over supplies on the deck. The captain, du Chaumaret, was walking around trying to look like he knew what he was doing, but he was mostly just ignoring his junior officers. See, the junior officers on the Medusa actually did know how to sail. They were holdovers from the Napoleonic Wars. They had combat experience. They knew the currents. And they absolutely hated their new captain. And du Chaumaret knew they hated him, so he decided the best leadership strategy was to just ignore everything they said. On June 17th, the convoy set sail. And almost immediately, du Chaumaret started making weird choices. Standard naval procedure said that a convoy should stay together. You move at the speed of your slowest ship. That way, if someone breaks a mast or springs a leak, you can help them. Basic stuff. But du Chaumaret loved the Medusa. He loved how fast she was. He wanted to show off. He wanted to prove that he was a dashing captain, not a rusty old aristocrat. So he just sailed away. He let the Medusa catch the wind and pull ahead of the Loire and the Argus. His officers gently suggested, Captain, maybe we should shorten sail and wait for the supply ships? And du Chaumaret basically said, nah, they'll catch up. They didn't. The only ship that could keep pace with the Medusa was the Echo. So, for a while, it was just the two of them racing down the Atlantic, leaving their support network behind. Now let's talk about navigation. In 1816, you navigated with a sextant, a chronometer, and a lot of math. You also use something called dead reckoning, which is basically guessing where you are based on how fast you think you're going. Du Chaumaret was a bit rusty on the math. And by a bit rusty, I mean he barely knew how to hold the sextant. But he found a friend. There was a passenger on board named Richefort, not to be confused with Rochefort, the port they left from. This guy Richefort was, well, he was a talker. He claimed to be a seasoned traveler. He told the captain, oh yes, I know the African coast like the back of my hand. I've been there 10 years, I've seen it all. The truth, Richefort had been a clerk in a prison office in India. He had never navigated a ship in his life. He was just a guy who liked to sound smart at dinner parties. But du Chaumaret loved him. Why? Because Richefort was a royalist. He had the right politics. And, more importantly, Richefort told the captain what he wanted to hear. So you have this incredible situation where the captain of a naval frigate is taking navigation advice from a random passenger, while ignoring his actual trained lieutenants. The lieutenants would come up and say, Captain, our calculations show we are drifting too close to the coast, and Richefort would chime in, nonsense, my instincts tell me we have plenty of room. And the captain would nod and say, excellent point, Richefort, carry on. It was the blind leading the blind, except they were also arrogant and in charge of 400 lives. The voyage down to the equator was tense. The sailors were grumbling. They knew something was off. Sailors are superstitious and they're also practical. They can tell when the man at the wheel is faking it. The discipline on board began to slip. The soldiers were fighting below decks. The passengers were getting seasick. And Governor Schmaltz was just annoyed that the trip was taking so long. They had a close call near the island of Madeira. The captain miscalculated the approach so badly that they almost ran aground at night. They only avoided it because someone heard the waves breaking on the rocks and yelled. Most captains would take that as a wake-up call. Maybe check the charts, maybe apologize to the crew. Du Chaumaret just blamed the compass and kept going. Stupid compass, he probably muttered, must be a Bonapartist compass. By the time they reached the Canary Islands, the convoy was completely scattered. The Medusa was basically alone, except for the Echo trailing behind. They made a quick stop at Tenerife to pick up supplies, but du Chaumaret was in a rush. He wanted to get to Senegal. He wanted to start his glorious tenure as the man who delivered the governor. So they left quickly, pushing south. Now, here is where geography becomes important. If you look at a map of West Africa, specifically the coast of Mauritania, there is a massive sandbank. It's called the Bank of Argoun. It is huge. It stretches miles out into the ocean. It's notorious. Every sailor knows about it. It's a ship eater. The water gets shallow very gradually, and the sand shifts, so you can be miles from the shore and suddenly find yourself in 3 feet of water. The standard procedure for passing the Bank of Argoun is simple. You stay far, far away. You go out into the deep ocean, Give it a wide berth of like 100 miles just to be safe. You don't hug the coast. But Richefort, our standard passenger navigator, had a theory. He told the captain that we could shave days off the trip if we cut close to the edge of the bank. He insisted he knew the water. He said he could smell the depth, which, by the way, isn't a thing. The lieutenants were horrified. They argued, they brought out the charts, they pointed to the big area marked danger, shallow water, or whatever the 1816 French equivalent was. Attention, ici c'est pas bon. But Duchaumerey was feeling lucky. He trusted Richefort. He wanted to beat the other ships to Saint Louis. He wanted to win the race that no one else was running. On the night of July 1st, the Echo, the only ship still with them, signaled the Medusa. They used lanterns to basically say, hey, we're heading further out into the sea because the water is getting shallow and we aren't insane. You should follow us. Duchaumerey saw the signal. He saw the Echo turning west towards safety, and he ignored it. He kept his course, heading south-southeast, straight towards the invisible underwater shelf. He probably thought the Echo was being cowardly. The next morning, July 2nd, the water changed color. This is a classic sign. Deep ocean water is dark blue. Shallow water turns green, then muddy brown. The water around the Medusa was turning lighter. There were also weeds floating on the surface, another bad sign. Also, they caught fish that only live in shallow water. The signs were literally floating past the hull. The universe was screaming, "Turn the wheel, Hughes!" The officer of the watch, a guy named Maudet, went to the captain. He said, "Captain, the water is discolored. We are entering the shallows. We need to tack." Duchaumerey looked at the water. He looked at Richefort. Richefort said, "Oh, don't worry. It looks shallow, but it's just a reflection of the clouds. We have at least 100 fathoms of depth." 100 fathoms is deep. It's safe. Just to be sure, the captain ordered a sounding. This is where you drop a lead weight on a rope to measure the depth. But he didn't even slow the ship down to do it properly. The ship was cruising at about 8 or 9 knots. The sailor threw the lead, but because they were moving so fast, the rope angled back. It didn't go straight down. It gave a false reading. 18 fathoms, the sailor called out. 18 fathoms is not 100 fathoms. It is significantly less. It is, in fact, getting dangerous. But Richefort insisted. We are fine. Just a little anomaly. The crew was getting restless. The passengers were leaning over the rail, looking at the weirdly green water. Governor Schmaltz was in his cabin, probably writing a memo about efficiency. Finally, even Duchaumerey got a little nervous. He decided to turn slightly, just a little bit. But he didn't order the sails to be lowered. He didn't stop the ship. At roughly 3 p.m. on July 2nd, 1816, the Medusa was cruising under clear skies with a gentle breeze. The passengers were preparing for dinner. The orchestra, because yes, they had a small orchestra on board, was practicing a tune. The lead line was thrown again. The sailor cried out, 6 fathoms! 6 fathoms is shallow. That is panic time. Captain Duchaumerey finally realized that perhaps the guy from the prison office didn't know everything. He shouted, "Luff! Luff!" which basically means turn the ship into the wind to stop it. But it was too late. The Medusa was heavy, and she had momentum. She glided forward over the swells, and then that sound. The sound you never want to hear at sea. A long, grinding, crunching noise. The keel of the ship dragging through sand and coral. The ship didn't stop violently. It wasn't a crash like in a movie where everyone goes flying. It was a slow, agonizing halt. The ship shuddered, groaned, and then just stuck. They had run aground on the bank of Arguin. It happened at high tide, which is the worst possible time because it meant the water was only going to go down from there.
Silence fell over the deck. Everyone looked at each other. The expert passenger, Richefort, stood there probably looking very awkward. The captain looked pale. A woman's voice broke the silence. It was Governor Schmaltz's wife, exclaiming, "Oh my, have we stopped?" "Yes, madam, you have stopped." The Medusa was stranded miles from the coast, in the middle of a desert of water. And this is where the incompetence shifts from funny bureaucrat to life-threatening negligence. Because getting stuck is bad, but what you do after you get stuck is what determines if you live or die. And Deschamps was about to give a masterclass on how to do everything wrong.
Part 2. The Great Unloading. So the Medusa is stuck, firmly stuck. It's sitting there on the sandbank like a beached whale, and the realization is slowly washing over everyone that this is actually happening. You can imagine the scene on deck. The music stopped, the polite conversation stopped, and suddenly everyone turned to look at the captain. Now, a good captain in this situation takes charge. He barks orders, he rallies the crew, he projects confidence. Deschamps did not do that. He effectively froze. He was in a state of shock. The lieutenants, however, the guys who actually knew how to sail, started yelling. One of them actually grabbed Richefort, the expert passenger who got them into this mess, and threatened to throw him overboard right then and there, which honestly would have been a pretty solid move for morale. But they didn't do it. Instead, they started trying to free the ship. The first rule of getting a ship off a sandbank is simple. Make the ship lighter. You need to float higher in the water. So you start throwing heavy things into the ocean. But here is where bureaucracy comes back to bite them. The Medusa was carrying 14 heavy cannons. These are massive chunks of iron. Throwing them overboard would have been perfect. It would have shed tons of weight instantly. But the captain hesitated. Why? Because the cannons were technically the property of the king, and he was terrified of filling out the paperwork explaining why he lost the king's expensive guns. So instead of tossing the cannons, they tossed the food. They threw barrels of flour into the sea, they threw away the drinking water, they emptied the freshwater tanks to save weight. Let's just pause and appreciate the logic here. They are stranded in the ocean, under the African sun, miles from help, and the first thing they decide to get rid of is the fresh water. Because apparently, dying of thirst is preferable to an audit from the Ministry of Marine. They spent the next few days trying to pull the ship off the bank using anchors. This is a process called cudging. You row an anchor out into deep water, drop it, and then everyone on the ship pulls on the rope to drag the vessel forward. It's exhausted work. The sailors were sweating, cursing, and looking at the captain with murder in their eyes. And the crazy thing is, it almost worked. At high tide, the ship actually started to move. It floated free for a brief moment. Everyone cheered. They were drifting into deeper water. But then the tide turned. The current pushed them back. And because they had thrown away their second anchor earlier, don't ask why, just another bad decision, they couldn't stop the ship from sliding right back onto the sandbank. Crunch? Again. And this time, the ocean was done playing nice. The weather turned. A storm blew in. The waves started hammering the hull. The Medusa was a strong ship, but no wooden ship can withstand being pounded against solid sand and coral by angry waves. The rudder snapped off, the stern began to smash open, water started flooding the hold. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a wreck. It was time to evacuate. Now, we have to talk about the math. This is the part of the story that turns a mishap into a tragedy. There were roughly 400 people on board the Medusa. There were 6 lifeboats. If you are good at mental math, you can already see the problem.
Even if they packed those boats like a tin of sardines, they could hold maybe 250 people, maximum. That leaves about 150 people with nowhere to go. A council was held in the captain's cabin. You had Governor Schmaltz, Captain de Chamarays, and the senior officers. They sat down to decide who lived and who had to figure something else out. Governor Schmaltz, as you might expect, was very concerned with the safety of Governor Schmaltz. He and his family were prioritized for the best boats. The captain, too, reserved a spot for himself. The senior officers took the other boats. But what about the soldiers? What about the low-ranking sailors? What about the kitchen staff? Governor Schmaltz came up with a plan. He was an engineer, remember? He looked at some spare masts and heavy wooden beams lying on the deck and said, "I have an idea. Let's build a machine." He called it the machine. It was a raft. But it wasn't supposed to be a survival raft, not really. The plan as sold to the crew was this. The 150 extra people would stand on this large wooden raft. The 6 lifeboats, which would be carrying the VIPs and the officers, would tie ropes to the raft. They would tow the raft to the shore. The coast of Africa was only about 40 miles away. It would take maybe 2 or 3 days of rowing. It would be a little uncomfortable, sure, but everyone would make it together. A grand convoy of survival. "We will not abandon you," the governor promised. "We will tow you all the way to the beach." It sounded plausible if you didn't think about it too hard. So the carpenters started building the machine. And let me tell you, this was not a well-designed piece of engineering. It was basically a bunch of heavy timbers lashed together in a rough triangle or rectangle shape. It was huge, about 20 meters long and 7 meters wide. That's pretty big, roughly the size of a modern tennis court, maybe a bit smaller. But it had no hull. It was just flat wood. It had no keel. It had no railing. It was literally just a floor floating on the water. While the raft was being built, the chaos on the ship escalated. The soldiers broke into the wine spirits room. If they were going to die, they were going to die drunk. Men were stumbling around the tilting deck, smashing bottles, singing aggressive songs, and threatening the officers. The governor barricaded himself in his cabin with his family, probably clutching his pearls and his silverware. Finally, on July 5th, the order was given to evacuate ship. The evacuation was a mess. It was every man for himself. Captain de Chamarays, the man responsible for this entire disaster, was one of the first into a boat. He lowered himself into his private barge, carefully stepping over his sailors to get to safety. He didn't stay on deck to ensure everyone got off. He didn't check the lower decks. He just left. He actually forgot to send a boat back for a few men who were too drunk to move, so about 17 people were just left behind on the rotting carcass of the Medusa. We'll come back to them much, much later. The governor and his family got into the most comfortable boat. They had luggage. They had sailors to row for them. It was quite civilized. And then there was the raft. 147 people were herded onto the raft. Who were they? They were the soldiers of the African battalion, the guys nobody liked. They were the junior officers who didn't have the right connections. They were the sailors who weren't needed to row the VIP boats. There was also one woman on the raft, a canteen worker named Madame Launay. As the 147 people stepped onto the raft, a horrifying reality set in. Governor Schmaltz's engineering calculations were off. The raft was made of heavy wood. It wasn't very buoyant. When the first 50 people got on, it was fine. When the next 50 got on, it started to sink. By the time all 147 people were on board, the raft wasn't floating on the water, it was floating in the water. The surface of the raft was about 3 feet underwater. Just imagine that. You are safe on the raft, but you are standing in waist-deep water. You are packed in so tight you can't sit down. If you move to the edge, you fall off. The people in the middle are being crushed by the people on the outside trying to squeeze in. And they had almost no supplies. Why? Because in the chaos of loading, the water and food barrels were lost or forgotten. They had a few casks of wine, of course, some soaked biscuits that turned into a paste immediately, and that was about it. No charts, no compass. The captain had promised to hand them a compass, but in his haste to leave, he forgot. But they still had the plan, the tow. The 6 lifeboats lined up in single file. They tied heavy ropes to the raft. The governor's boat, the captain's boat, all of them. The sailors in the boats began to row. The ropes got taut. The heavy, waterlogged raft lurched forward.
It was working. Slowly, painfully, but it was moving. For about 2 hours, the convoy made its way toward the distant coast. There was a sense of hope. Okay, this is miserable, my legs are wet, and I'm pressed against a stranger's armpit, but we are moving. But towing a submerged wooden platform with 150 people on it is incredibly hard work. The current was strong, the boats were struggling, the progress was agonizingly slow. And then, the governor and the captain had a little chat. Or maybe it was a thought that occurred to them simultaneously. They looked at the raft dragging behind them. It was a dead weight. It was slowing them down. If a storm came, the raft would pull the boats under. If the people on the raft panicked and tried to climb into the boats, everyone would drown. Self-preservation is a powerful instinct. But in the 19th century aristocracy, self-preservation was often disguised as necessity. Someone, and history is a little fuzzy on exactly who gave the order, though everyone blames the governor, decided that the tow was impossible. One by one, the ropes connecting the boats to the raft were cast off. Some accounts say the ropes snapped. But ropes don't just snap all at once on every boat, simultaneously. The people on the raft saw the sailors in the boats reaching for knives. They saw the knots being untied. "Wait!" they screamed. "What are you doing? Don't leave us!" The captain's boat dropped the line. The governor's boat dropped the line. And then the boats simply rowed away. The people on the raft stood in their waist-deep water, watching in disbelief. They shouted. They begged. They held up their hats. The boats didn't turn back. Governor Schmaltz later claimed he didn't hear them. Captain de Chaumeraise just kept his eyes forward. They rowed toward the coast, leaving 147 people floating on a pile of logs in the middle of the ocean with no food, no water, no compass, and no hope. The gap between the boats and the raft grew wider. The white sails of the lifeboats got smaller and smaller until they disappeared over the horizon. And then, silence descended on the raft. The sun was setting, the water was getting colder, and 147 people were left alone with each other. The first night on the raft is remembered as the night of disbelief. They couldn't process the betrayal. Surely the boats would come back. Surely it was a mistake. They lit a small fire in a bucket to signal their position. They waited, but nobody came. As the darkness took over, the wind picked up. The waves started to crash over the people standing on the edges. If you fell off, you were gone. There was no way to turn the raft around. Fear started to turn into panic, and panic in a confined space with no exit is a very dangerous thing. The machine had become a prison, and the social contract, the idea that we are all in this together, had been severed the moment those ropes were cut. Now, there were no officers, no governors, no rules. just 147 terrified human beings standing on a sinking wooden island in the middle of the ocean with no food, no water, no compass, and no hope. This is where the story shifts from a bureaucratic failure to a psychological nightmare. Because when you strip away hope, authority, and basic physical needs, people change. And they change very, very quickly. We are entering the first circle of hell, folks. So fluff your pillow, take a sip of water, and be glad you are in a warm bed and not standing in the Atlantic Ocean in 1816, because things are about to get very, very dark.
Part 3. The Raft of Madness. So, the sun has gone down, the lifeboats are gone, and 147 people are standing on a wooden platform that is sinking under their weight. Let's just take a moment to really visualize the physical reality of this, because it is crucial to understanding why things went wrong so fast. The raft wasn't a boat, it was just logs lashed together. Because it was overloaded, the center of the raft was submerged in about 3 feet of water. If you were standing in the middle, the ocean was up to your waist. If you were on the edges, it was up to your knees. This meant you couldn't sit down, you couldn't lie down. If you tried to rest, you would drown. You had to stand, pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, swaying with the waves, constantly shivering because the water was cold and the night air was colder. The only people who could stay relatively dry were a small group of officers who clustered around a few barrels of wine in the center. They had a little elevated platform, maybe a foot high. Everyone else was just soaking. Now, human beings are social creatures. We like rules. We like cues. We like knowing who is in charge. But when you remove the ground from under someone's feet, literally, and you remove the hope of rescue, the social brain turns off and the lizard brain turns on. The first night was bad, but mostly just sad. The wind picked up, the sea got rough, the raft would pitch forward and everyone would fall onto each other. It was a mass of tangled limbs and screaming. People were crying out for their mothers, for God, for the captain who had left them. Some of the younger soldiers, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, just gave up. They let go of the ropes and allowed the waves to wash them away. It was a quiet exit. They just slid into the dark. By the time the sun came up on the second day, about 20 people were gone. They had either been washed overboard or crushed to death in the scrum of bodies. Morning brought a little bit of calm. The sun was warm. The sea settled down. For a few hours, the survivors fell into sort of collective delusion. They told themselves, the boats will come back. The governor just went to get help. He'll be back by lunch. They scanned the horizon. Every cloud looked like a sail. Every wave looked like a boat. But the horizon remained empty. And then the hunger started. They had been standing in salt water for 24 hours. They were dehydrated. And remember, the only supplies they had were soaked biscuits, which were gone immediately, and wine. Barrels and barrels of wine. Now, in a survival situation, alcohol is generally a bad idea. It dehydrates you, it impairs your judgment, it makes you emotional. But on the raft, wine was the only source of calories, so they drank. They tapped the casks, they passed around tin cups, and as the sun beat down on their heads and the alcohol hit their empty stomachs, the mood shifted. It stopped being sad and started being angry. The soldiers of the African battalion, these were tough guys, mercenaries, men who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars, started to look at the officers. The officers were dry. The officers had the wine. The officers were the ones whose friends had cut the ropes. Paranoia set in. The soldiers convinced themselves that the officers were planning to kill them, or maybe they just wanted to end it all. a strange kind of suicidal mania took hold of the group. It began on the second night. The sun went down, the darkness returned, and the terror came back with it. One of the soldiers, delirious with wine and salt water, stumbled over to the edge of the raft with an axe. He started hacking at the ropes that held the logs together. He wasn't trying to build a smaller raft. He was trying to destroy the entire thing. He wanted to sink everyone. If I die, we all die, was the general logic. An officer saw him and sliced him down with a saber. Just like that. No trial, no warning, just a sword stroke in the dark. But that was the spark. The violence exploded. It wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It wasn't two armies lining up. It was a riot in a pitch-black, waist-deep mosh pit. The soldiers charged the officers. The officers, who were armed with swords and pistols, formed a defensive square near the mast. For hours, in the howling wind, they fought. It was chaotic and sloppy. Men were biting each other. They were trying to drown each other. The soldiers would rush the officers, get pushed back, regroup, drink more wine, and rush again. At one point, the soldiers grabbed the only woman on the raft, Madame Launay, and threw her into the ocean. The chief engineer, a guy named Corriard, remember his name, he's important, tied a rope around his waist and jumped in to save her. He hauled her back onto the raft. She was unconscious but alive. Then the soldiers tried to throw Corriard overboard. He was saved by his friends. It went on like this all night. Screaming, splashing, the clash of steel, the thud of bodies. And all the while, the raft was drifting aimlessly, rocking in the waves, indifferent to the little wars of the fleas on its back. By the time the sun came up on the third day, the raft looked like a slaughterhouse. The fighting had stopped, mostly because everyone was exhausted, but the cost was staggering. In that one night of madness, 65 people had died. Some had been killed by sabers, some were trampled, many had just been pushed off the edge and drowned.
The population of the raft had dropped from roughly 127 after the first night to about 60. The survivors were battered. They had deep cuts. Their clothes were shredded. They were trembling from adrenaline and cold. And they were starving. It had been 3 days without real food. The human body can go a long time without food, but the psychological hunger, the gnawing, desperate need to eat, was overpowering. And right there, all around them, piled up in the center of the raft, were the bodies of the mutineers. It started quietly. Someone, probably trying to hide what they were doing, cut a piece of flesh from a thigh. They ate it raw. And someone else did it. It wasn't a ritual, it wasn't malicious, it was just biological. The taboo against cannibalism is strong, but the drive to survive is stronger. Some of the officers refused at first. They tried to eat other things. They tried to chew on their leather belts. They tried to eat the leather lining of their hats. But leather is full of chemicals and very hard to digest. It didn't help. Eventually, they saw the soldiers eating the dead, and they saw that the soldiers were getting stronger. Or at least, they weren't fainting. So, the officers joined in. They dried strips of human meat on the mast in the sun, like jerky. It was a practical, horrifying decision. They turned their fallen shipmates into rations. By the fourth day, the raft had established a new, grim hierarchy. The weak were gone, the naive were gone. The only people left were the ones willing to do anything to stay alive. But the universe wasn't done testing them yet. On the fourth day, another school of thought emerged among the survivors. They had survived the mutiny, they had eaten the dead, But they were still stuck. And they were still drinking wine. The hallucinations began to set in properly now. This wasn't just, I think I see a boat. This was full-blown psychosis. One officer tried to write a letter to the governor to ask for a fresh horse. He thought he was in a cafe in Paris. Another man thought the ocean was a grassy field and tried to walk off the raft to have a picnic. He stepped into the water and sank like a stone before anyone could grab him. Corriar, the engineer, later wrote that he saw the most beautiful things. He saw fountains of alabaster. He saw forests. He had long conversations with people who weren't there. The reality, of course, was much uglier. They were covered in sores. The salt water was corroding their skin. Their legs were swollen from standing up for 90 hours straight. And then, inevitably, the second mutiny happened. You would think, after the massacre of the second night, they would be too tired to fight. But the wine was still there, and the paranoia was still there. On the night of the fourth day, the remaining soldiers, mostly Spanish and Italian mercenaries, decided that the officers were still the enemy. They tried to throw the remaining wine overboard just to spite everyone. The officers, realizing that the wine was the only thing keeping them conscious, attacked. This fight was shorter, but just as brutal. The officers were more organized. They threw the ringleaders into the sea. By the morning of the fifth day, only 30 people remained alive. 30 out of 147. In 5 days,
A small white butterfly. It landed on the mast. It was the first living thing they had seen in 10 days that wasn't a shark or a human. It meant land was near. Or maybe it was just a lost butterfly, doomed like them. They watched it with a kind of childlike wonder. It was a tiny speck of innocence in a world of absolute horror. And then, on the morning of July 17th, 13 days after they had been cast adrift, one of them looked up. The horizon, which had been empty for 2 weeks, wasn't empty anymore. There was a speck, a tiny white triangle in the distance. It was a sail.